Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Rich. It's 8:30, and we have a scheduled audit committee meeting planned. Just trying to give it another moment or two to get a couple of more members to join here. We do have Dwight from PB Mares, the auditor, here. So I'll just ask that we just give it another minute or two and see if some additional committee members join here. So just hold tight. Thank you. And on cue, the chair of the audit committee has just logged into the virtual meeting. So good morning, Chair Crystal.
Good morning, Mr. Dalton. It looks like we've got a good prompt group of our committee.
Absolutely.
Are we ready to launch in, or do we need a minute to go live?
We are live, Chair Crystal, and Dwight's here from PB Mares, so I think we're ready to go. We'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome, Mr. Bierker. It's great to see you again, albeit virtually. I think just by way of introduction, it looks like we have our full committee here. Mr. Skinner, Mr. Walkinshaw, Mr. Kelly, I know I saw Ms. Bomke, Ms. Bailey. Thank you all so much for making time. I think this is a mix of audit committee veterans and perhaps one or two that are new to our committee. So Dwight, I think this is your, how many years now doing the audit for VRE? More than you care to count?
Yeah, no, right. Starting to show my age, I guess. I think I've been involved with the audit for approximately 15 years now, whether that was starting as a staff through manager, and now I currently serve as the partner on the engagement for the previous 3 years. So have a long history with VRE. It's been a great relationship and have enjoyed every year working with VRE. So.
Excellent. Well, we're glad to see you again. Thank you. This meeting is an opportunity. Oh, and I see your chair as well, Ms. Bennett Parker. Thank you for joining us in the committee. This meeting is an opportunity for us to set the frame with Dwight about the audit for the year ahead. I think he can share with us a little bit about areas for focus. And we also have the opportunity as members of the committee on behalf of the operations board to share if there are particular areas that we would hope Mr. Bierker and his colleagues would pay a particular eye to or give us some analysis on. So Mr. Bierker, would you like to just begin and talk to us a little bit about kind of the scope of your usual audit and any areas of focus you proposed for this year of 2021?
Certainly, Madam Chair. So annually, we're required to meet with the audit committee for you all that may be new to kind of provide an update of where we are currently with the audit, and also give you an opportunity to express any concerns or areas of concern that you would like us to take a look at when we go back to complete the audit. We completed preliminary field work a few weeks ago. During that time, our preliminary field work mainly focuses on the internal control testing that we have to do annually, and also the compliance testing that the auditor of public accounts establishes for us, the guidelines for us to follow, along with the federal funding. We audit that money as part of the PRTC audit engagement that we also audit. So the federal funding that flows through PRTC to VRE is subject to the single audit, and we've performed that field work also. When we come back in the fall to complete our audit, that's mainly going to focus on the year-end balance sheet, income statement, things of that nature. So we'll focus on that area. But through our preliminary field work, we had no findings on controls that we tested around procurement, payroll, expense reimbursement, credit cards, purchase cards, things of that nature. We found no issues with anything there. And, I just want to say to Mark, Alex, their staff there at VRE and Rich that, during the pandemic, they did a great job of implementing some new controls around kind of a paperless process that VRE didn't have in place. And I think it's positioning them well into the future with the new ERP system that's being implemented that'll allow them to piggyback off some of those controls and implement in the future that'll make things even better for the organization. So far this year, we have nothing to report on. They were, staff there fully prepared for the preliminary field work got us everything we needed. No open end items currently, so we're looking forward to coming back in late August to finish the audit engagement.
Thank you. And so colleagues, if we have questions or areas of focus, I'll get us started with just one, which is you mentioned the ways in which the pandemic has perhaps forced VRE to do its business separately. I think it's also certainly upended and fortunately replaced many of our traditional funding streams. And one of the things I know we've been talking about a lot in our local jurisdictions is the various federal requirements around first the CARES round of funding, then the Rescue and Recovery Act round of funding. And so I just wondered to what extent the audit might consider or take up compliance with federal programming requirements or federal funding requirements that may be brand new or unique to the last, I guess, 18 months or so.
Yeah, great question. With the CARES Act funding, if you recall, that money was subject to the single audit procedures last year. You spent some of that money in the fourth quarter of your fiscal year. So we did, that was subject to audit last year, and the guidelines that the Department of Transportation and FTA has placed out there, they have not changed. So we were able to audit that money, a portion of that money last year, and then this year we'll audit a full year of that funding to ensure that everything has been done in compliance with those guidelines and the money's been properly spent. So
great, thank you.
And just the that's part of the PRTC audit engagement.
Okay.
That we audit the funding there because as you all know, PRTC handles the federal funding for VRE. So just wanted to reiterate that is part of that engagement, and we also look at it at the VRE level. So
I see. Okay, thank you. Could I ask our team, is it possible to take down the slide so that I can see more faces at once of the committee members? I'm scrolling through to see if it looks like anybody has a question, but it might be easier if we could just, that's better. Thank you so much. All right. Okay, so colleagues, questions or areas of focus that you'd like to raise to our colleagues from PB Maris? Mr. Walkinshaw.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Dwight, just a question, and I don't want to like dredge up any kind of unpleasantness from the past, but for those of us who are relatively new, could you share, I mean, since you've been doing this audit for a number of years, I mean, can you share some of the issues or things that you've come across in the past, kind of areas of concern or things that you've flagged in the past that can be areas of improvement? It sounds like there aren't really any in the last couple of years, but in the past, what has your work uncovered?
I guess when we first started the engagement years ago, there was a lot of issues around capital assets and accounting for that. But then Donna Boxer was hired. She was brought in and with the was able to address all those issues. That was at the beginning of the audit for us as auditors. Subsequent to then, there hasn't been a lot of audit adjustments. The staff there, they do an excellent job of having everything reconciled and things of that nature before we come and provide us schedules that are accurate. The only areas that we've really had issues around is when there may be a new GASB implementation. We work with staff to make sure they understand that and they can get the accounting correct. Journal entries, audit adjustments over the past several years. Probably in the past 5 years, we may have had 2 or 3 audit adjustments, and those were just some slight oversights by staff, but nothing of significance. So the staff there, Mark, Alex, I mean, they do an excellent job of accounting for things. And I have really no concerns. Obviously, the federal funding that's received, that's highly scrutinized. So we audit that as part of the PRTC audit. And, that's an area we pay a lot of attention to and focus on. So I don't have any concerns there. I think the staff does an excellent job and they have the people in position to handle all aspects of that. So
other than the capital asset issue many years ago, nothing kind of systemic in recent history.
Correct. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Good question. Anyone else? Mr. Kelly is our voice of institutional knowledge. Any thoughts
I
either?
see Supervisor Bailey's hand is up.
Oh, forgive me. Did anybody else get an update for Webex? I feel like there's a new version of the computer-based app. Andrea, forgive me for not seeing that. Good morning, Supervisor
No
Bailey. Over
problem.
to you.
No problem, Katie, at all. And there is a new version, and the hand doesn't normally look like the hand, so it's okay. So I think Mr. Walkinshaw asked the question that I've certainly needed to be answered, and I appreciate him asking that. The other question that I had was, pardon my greenness, but what's GASME?
Oh, so that's the Government Auditing Standards Board that we have, that VRE has to report under. If you think about the private sector, you always hear GAAP financial. So this is the guidance that the financial statements are issued under. And when I first started my career in early 2000, I think we were at GASB 34, and now we're closing on GASB 100. So in just a 20-year period, they've added close to 70 new pronouncements that we have to make sure we're able to implement and follow if it applies to VRE. So.
Okay, thank you so much. I thought so, but I didn't want to assume. I didn't want to be too smart and really not know anything.
No, great question. So.
Thank you.
And they got real active with their pronouncements after the recession, right? Of the late aughts, when it turned out a lot of municipal jurisdictions were going to bond market, et cetera, without
Yeah, as I said, in 50 years they had only issued 34 pronouncements, and in the past 20 we're closing in on 70. And there's some that don't relate to VRE. They'll relate to the jurisdictions that you all represent, the counties, the towns, cities. But the ones that do relate to VRE, we work with staff and help them understand and help implement those when we can. The next large one coming up for VRE is the lease standard, which we're once I think they get through the ERP system conversion, we'll start to work on that and we'll work through that. So.
Interesting. Thank you for the good questions. Anyone else have questions, comments, areas they'd like to see PB mayors focus on in particular?
Madam Chair, Ms. Crystal. Yes, I'd just like to know, is VRE the largest jurisdiction that you audit, or do you do the contract for Northern Virginia, transfer to NVTC, or any others?
Yes, ma'am. So me personally, I handle the PRTC engagement, NVTC, VRE engagement. PB mayors, we also handle NVTA, HR TAC, basically anything related to transit in the state of Virginia. I think we have, we work with, so, and other clients throughout Northern Virginia. So, but I handle the two commissions and VRE audit engagements.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Great question. I'm sure my colleagues on the authority leadership board would note that they handle over $1 billion in assets of revenue and allocation. So point out that they're so much bigger than us. Anything else? Yes. Hello, Mr. Stork.
Good morning. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be on this committee or not, but you did. I'm chair of the audit committee on the Fairfax County Board, and my question is your work specifically financial only, or do you do performance audits as well?
The current contract, sir, is just for the financial statement audit and compliance audit for VRE. We do performance audit work, but we haven't been engaged by VRE for that type of work.
Do you do that for any of the entities that you were just identifying?
I believe we currently have a project ongoing for NVTA that started recently, related to performance and some agreed upon procedures around expenses that's been incurred and paid to jurisdictions here recently. So yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Stork. Glad to have you with us.
Chair Crystal,
Yes, please, Ms. Bailey.
I just wanted to say to Dwight that when Meg asked about what other responsibilities you have with other entities, I find it very easy, and this is just feedback for you, sir, to follow you because I'm on the PRTC board, and so I find it easy. That's why I felt comfortable asking that question, to follow your report out, you know, and for those of us that are new to the board, you know, you're very giving and pointing us in the right direction and helping us to understand. So Ms. Bonke's question was so apropos because it just really, you know, in partnering with the PRTC board and VRE, it just helps me a lot. So I just want, as feedback for you, I just wanted to, you know, just make that apparent to you.
I appreciate those words, ma'am. And I recall last year, you know, we did something a little different with PRTC's committee, and that's something this committee would like. You know, we did a little more in-depth presentation of the financials to educate individuals on, because there had been a lot of change and turnover on the PRTC board. So in the fall, if that's something that is requested or would like to be done, you know, we'd be more than glad to put together something similar presentation. I thought that was a great meeting that evening when we went through the financials in a little more detail. Yeah. So
Chair Crystal, with the question that Ms. Bailey just asked, it leads me to another question. And Mr. Stork asked about the performance. What kind of advice would you give the audit committee on how would we go about making a decision, and what would drive that decision if we wanted to do a performance or audit?
Is that question for me, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Oh, obviously, you know, the committee here would have to come to an agreement on what the scope of that engagement would look like. And then depending on, you know, there could be some procurement issues there, depending on the size of the engagement, that it could go out for bid if it's over certain thresholds, obviously. But it's something that we could handle if it falls within the contract. It would be a separate engagement outside of the audit engagement contract that we currently have.
But more my question is, on what basis would you recommend that we do a performance? Or is there anything in our current audit unrelated to performance that you might see as not a red flag, maybe a yellow flag, and go, this might be something that they might want to look into?
Currently, there's nothing that I have concerns of. I think, you know, the staff there are on top of things from a financial perspective. You know, on the horizon, there could be, with the implementation of the new accounting system, there could be some agreed upon procedures outside the scope of the audit that that VRE may want to entertain us coming in and performing some additional work around. Whenever you go through a large implementation such as this, you know, there are some areas that some things can kind of slip through the cracks. It's not going to be something specific to VRE. We see it all the time with clients that go through this process. So to ensure, you know, you have all adequate controls, rights within the system, things of that nature, that could kind of be a performance audit that you would bring us in to assess the new accounting system. But that's the only thing I see currently.
To the extent it's helpful to share, and Mr. Stork may have other examples, my jurisdiction hired a performance auditor about 5 years ago, shortly before my tenure on the board. And the things that have sort of bubbled up for audits from him tend to be, you know, exactly as Mr. Burker said, the performance pieces, right? So as an example, we had some concerns about public safety overtime. We were seeing on a, you know, annual budget basis, just huge bills for overtime. And we had questions as the governing body about, you know, are we operating in a way where it would actually be more prudent and fiscally responsible to grow the strength of our police force and fire department, and spend less in overtime. And so we assigned our performance auditor that question. So it wasn't really about implementation of, kind of financial standards. And it certainly wasn't, what they do is not waste, fraud, and abuse. We have a separate financial auditor for that, but it was more of sort of, analyzing how the fire department and the police department coded overtime, how people were submitting hourly, forgive me, it's still early, the coffee hasn't kicked in, timesheets, right, for overtime and that sort of thing. I will say it's not like it yielded great insights, singular insights that we could implement tomorrow, but it did, sort of surface some interesting practices. So that's one example to the extent it's helpful. Mr. Stork might have others. The only reason I have not thought to push for that in the past with VRE is that the organization is still relatively small. And sometimes I think those performance audits are really helpful when you have just, pretty sizable bureaucracies, really, right? And there's sort of challenges about how things are getting implemented and passed down across, dozens or maybe even hundreds of people. But Mr. Stork, I'd be interested in if you have examples from Fairfax of what performance audits look like for you all.
A lot of some of we're doing right now has to do with escrow funds and entitlements and things that counties in particular, you get money for the escrow to do certain things or proffers, et cetera, and those don't always get, let's just say we have some that go back more than 50 years. So it's like, is that right? Or is there a problem with that? Or is that, no, some of them should be back there, or there's companies that are gone, et cetera. So I'm not as, and that's my challenge here, is that I'm not as clear as to what that would be for VRE. And that's ultimately would be more of a conversation with somebody who sees a lot of different transit companies and would have maybe some other insights that I wouldn't have. I mean, the overtime one, Katie, is one that we clearly went through that same process, and some of the internal processes that departments use to make sure we understand it, or make sure, frankly, they're properly documented. And so we have issues with stormwater and sometimes how spills take place, how we respond, whether or not we have the right systems in place to minimize that. I mean, it really could be about anything. I'm going to look to others here that obviously have been around a lot longer, have a better sense of what that is. But I think where I would go is where you ended up, which is VRE is such a small organization. It really would be, I think, behoove us to see somebody such as yourself that would have looked at a lot of different organizations and would see where those areas are most sensitive and where opportunities might exist. And obviously that's what we look for from our CEO as well. So.
Yeah, if we saw an area where we thought there could be a recommendation, obviously we would make that. I primarily work in transit and authorities such as water sewer authorities. So we have done like rate studies and things of that nature for water sewer authorities. Other members of our niche, government niche that work with the counties and cities, they have done more performance type engagements. The one that you mentioned around proffers, we have some counties that's been holding proffers for years. So just trying to figure out, the legality between should the county reimburse them or repay that money, or what should happen there. Overtime is always a huge item. We did a huge study for Prince William County a few years ago related to overtime and things of that nature. So we can do the performance engagements, but for an entity the size of VRE and the other transit clients that I service, we'd have to really zero in on what we'd want to look at, because there's only so much we can do. I think the ERP system is probably one area that we may want to take a look at in the future.
Thank you. An excellent question. Thank you for asking it. And one I think that should be on the table for us as the audit committee. So we can also ask for insights from Mr. Dalton, Mr. Schofield. I know we've got Ms. Nutter on the call with us too. If their systems, sometimes management can flag their own areas for performance audit, right? It can be a little fraud if you're asking them to flag areas for financial audit. We really want independence there. But performance audits, my sense anyway from our own jurisdictional experiences, can often be the outcome of management working with governing bodies to identify ways we think things could work better. All right. And oh, Mr. Kelly, good morning.
Good morning, all. Question: We meet compliance, and we have a great staff, and I don't really have any issues with the way we do things. I would note one thing, and that there are boards that I serve on, regional boards, and a lot of this depends on a philosophical as elected officials and how far you want to get into the weeds or not. Because pretty much we have the pre-audit, we go through the year, we get the end audit. We pass a budget, we get to the end of the year, and we go on to the next budget. And there's that time in between those. And a number of boards and commissions that I serve on with budgets, we get a monthly report saying, here's the budget, and it's usually just an Excel spreadsheet. Here's where we are in personnel. This is the amount we have for personnel. This is the amount we've expended. And it's sometimes interesting to look at to see how the money's spent and what way it's spent. And you come up and you will see, well, wait a minute, we're not spending half of, or we're a little bit higher over here. Now, I know Rich does do a pretty good job in letting us know when we've hit a snag in the budget, but it's also an opportunity just to kind of see how the budget rolls through an entire year. And you get a sense of how things go up, down. And it does, on a lot of occasions, bring up questions of, well, why is that down and why is that up? Again, that's what happens with a number of boards I serve on with regards to the financial aspect. I don't know if the VRE board wants to get to that level, but I would assume, and Rich can comment on this, it's not a difficult thing to do. I mean, the information's in the computer, you have it by category, you can pretty much track your expenditures, because we have to do that to be able to report this information. But there are boards that I serve on, and every month we get a report and says, here's where we are with the budget. Here's what we budgeted. Here's what we expended. We're at 100%. We're on track. We're not on track. This is why we're not on track. And especially for the newer members, it's not a bad thing of information to have, so you understand how the budget rolls through and how the expenditures are made or not made. That's all I would throw out there.
I promise this is not a punt. This is a sincere comment. The Finance Committee meets today after this meeting, and I actually think this would be a great conversation for the Finance Committee. Ms. Bonke, you're our chair, right? For Finance, we could take this up, right? And just think about what that practice could look like. I think it's a really interesting point to just sort of be a little more active in our monitoring.
I'll comment, and Mark can maybe add to this. With the Munis implementation, the system that VRE is currently, set to go live with here in the new fiscal year, I think the budgeting to actual reporting is going to be a tool that they're going to be able to generate a lot easier. The system that's being used now, I mean, we see budget to actual reports, they're provided to us, but I think with the new system, it's going to provide VRE with a more depth in reporting. And Mark's probably been in the weeds of that, so he could maybe add to that a little bit. But
yes, Dwight, you're exactly right. Munis will provide us a significant improvement on our reporting ability. We do have in the monthly CEO report a very sort of boiled down look at how the budget has been over the previous month. We could certainly talk about expanding that and providing more detail, whatever the board would like to see.
All right. Well, as we close in on the 9 o'clock hour, I think I can give this task because I serve on the Finance Committee, so I'm not just punting it off to somebody else. We can take this question up. I think it's a good suggestion. Okay, so unless there are any burning final comments, I'm going to thank Mr. Bierker. We'll see you again. Remind me when the audit will be complete. What time frame?
So we're scheduled, I think it's the week of August 24th. I think we will come for final, and then we typically deliver the financial report at the November meeting. So
excellent.
We'll see everyone then. And I'm sure I'll see some of these faces on upcoming meetings for PRTC and MVTC. So
that's right. That's right. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you in person in November. And with that, thank you, Audit Committee members, for the great discussion. And back over to our chair.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal, and all members of the Audit Committee. That was a great discussion and ended just on time for us to transition to the main meeting. So the VRE Operations Board will now come to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call a roll?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Alcorn,
Here.
Ms. Bailey,
Present?
Mr. Banks,
Here.
Ms. Bennett Parker,
Here.
Ms. Bonke,
Here,
Ms. Crystal,
Here.
Ms. Franklin, Mr. Kelly,
Here.
Ms. Lawson,
Here.
Mr. McLaughlin,
Here.
Ms. Shelton,
Here.
Mr. Smith, Mr. Skinner.
Here.
Mr. Stork,
Present.
and Mr. Walkinshaw.
Here.
Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. As a reminder, we will be using a voice vote for everything today, so please be prepared to unmute your microphone when appropriate to register your vote, and then to cut down on background noise, please make sure to keep your microphone muted when you're not voting or asking a question. Webex has updated, as we learned in our last meeting, and I may or may not see if you have your hand raised. I can also only see a few of you at a time, so please, if you have a question on an item, feel free to speak up and I will recognize you. With that, we'll move to our consent agenda, which consists of the following. Resolution 2A, finding the need to conduct the June 25th, 2021 meeting electronically. We find that meeting by electronic means is authorized because the nature of the current declared emergency makes it both impractical and unsafe for the Operations Board to assemble in a single location. Are statutory required or necessary to continue operations, then discharge the Operations Board's lawful duties, and the items on today's agenda are encompassed within the continuity of operations ordinances adopted by several member localities of the VRE to assure continued operations during the disaster posed by the public health emergency resulting from COVID-19. Our consent agenda also includes 2B, approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion and a second to adopt the consent agenda?
So move, Madam Chair.
Second.
Thank you. That's been moved by Ms. Bailey and seconded by Ms. Crystal. All those in favor of adopting the consent agenda, please say aye.
aye,
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes. Next, we have the minutes of the May 21st meeting. Does anyone have any corrections to the minutes? Hearing none. Is there a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
So move, Madam Chair. Supervisor Bailey.
Second. This is Crystal.
Thank you. That's been moved by Ms. Bailey and seconded by Ms. Crystal. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Madam Chair, this is Gary. I will abstain.
Thank you, Mr. Skinner. Any other abstentions? Okay. The motion passes. Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to our June 25th meeting. A few announcements. First, VRE was recognized for its environmentally friendly efforts. We were honored as a green travel leader last week by the Virginia Green Travel Alliance for the environmentally friendly railcar disinfectant system we implemented during the pandemic. Executive Director of the Virginia Green Travel Alliance, Tom Griffin, presented the awards to Mr. Dalton during an award presentation at the Broad Run Maintenance and Storage Facility last week. We also want to congratulate Mr. Dalton for his seat on the Commuter Rail Coalition Board. The Commuter Rail Coalition is an association representing the interests, needs, and benefits of the nation's commuter railroads. And at their annual meeting on June 3rd, Mr. Dalton was elected to the board of directors as an at-large member. And then operationally speaking, our July meeting, we anticipate that will be held in person at PRTC. It is critical that you respond to the quorum call email sent out the week of the meeting so that we can establish that we will in fact be meeting. And then reminders of some upcoming committee meetings. The Finance Committee meets immediately after we adjourn today. You can see the members listed on the slide in front of you. We will have a legislative committee meeting after the July Operations Board meeting as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Dalton for CEO report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, Operations Board members and others. First off, just wanted to announce that effective Monday, June 21st, and consistent with CDC guidelines and those of other state and federal agencies, VRE has relaxed our capacity limitations on station platforms and on board our trains. And in addition to that, we relaxed our face mask requirements outdoors and on station platforms. But consistent with federal and state mandates, face masks are still required on board our trains. Ridership for the month of May continued to increase from previous months. This was the highest total ridership month since the beginning of the pandemic. And then consistent with total ridership, average daily ridership increased in May as well. As of June 1st, we did go back to a full schedule, and just again not audited, but currently we're seeing average daily ridership, excluding Fridays, of about anywhere from 2,400 to 2,600 riders, and continuing to increase. So we'll be able to show you a full month of that at the July meeting. On-time performance for May was 87% system-wide. This was obviously below our target of 90%. And as you can see, both the Manassas lines and Fredericksburg lines were about equal, but still under the 90% target. Just wanted to, along those lines, I just wanted to show, and this is a graph that we present each month in the CEO report. And the vertical bars that are in blue are represent a 3-year rolling average. And then of course the red horizontal bar just kind of shows the trend. And just wanted to point out that this is an area, you know, as we head into April, May, and into the summer months, this is an area that we continue to address, and primarily from a heat order standpoint. And as you recall, last year, between Memorial Day weekend and Labor Day, we enacted a seasonal schedule, and to obviously kind of combat the you know, the heat orders that plague our system throughout the summer. And when we break down the you know, the on-time performance for the month of May, on this particular graph, I just wanted to point out that, and you'll see that on the left graph, we've got this broke out into 2 halves of the month. The first 10 days of the month, if you just kind of run down to the bottom, our system on-time performance was what we are accustomed to, or have been accustomed to over the last year plus, at 92%. The last 10 days of the month, in addition to just seeing some random periodic things, we did get hit with some heat orders. And similar to last year, or not as bad as last year, but in that month of May, towards the end of May, we were getting hit with some heat orders. So one of the things that obviously we're going to look at is should we be implementing heat orders sooner? In other words, for the month of May. So we'll continue to collect that data and make that determination as we come back around to next year. One last thing I just also want to point out as far as on-time performance, you know, if I take the heat orders out and a couple other very random things, we had a trespasser incident. We did have some police activity around the Alexandria station due to a suspicious package one day. And then of course, a couple of delays due to a downed tree and a fairly rare VIP movement that shut the railroad down. Anyway, if I take those away, we would have ended the month at 92%. I also just want to point out too is that as I said last month, as we return to a full schedule June 1st, we knew we were going to have some, I won't say issues in the context of it being a bad thing, but nonetheless, knowing that we were going to come back and essentially saturate the network with a lot more trains, and of course Amtrak is adding some service back, and there's definitely additional freight trains out there. OTP is actually we're running in the low 80% right now, and bouncing back up. And I'll give you a full report, full analysis of that at our July meeting. But as anticipated, when we return to a full schedule, it was going to be a little rough, and it has been. And the other element of that is simply, again, dispatchers have not. There is, in a lot of cases, the dispatchers just haven't had the experience of dispatching us under a full schedule. And of course, we have 3 host railroads that dispatch us, and all 3 of those host railroads, have to work in some harmony. But we're working our way through it. We meet daily with all of our host railroads, and we're working our way out of this. So just wanted to take a few extra minutes on on-time performance and let you know where we were and where we're headed. My project spotlight for this month, I've provided some information on our construction cameras, construction videos in my weekly update, but I just wanted to, remind everybody that we do have these construction videos, or access to these construction videos through our project update page on our website, and you can link through those. But first of all, we have 3 up right now. And as we continue to add projects where there's, I'll just say, there's physical improvements, something that you can see, we will continue to add construction videos. So we have them up right now at the Crossroads Maintenance and Storage Facility. For the Loop project, we have one up at Quantico for the Quantico Station Improvement Project, and we have it up at Rolling Road as well. And as I just previously mentioned, they are accessible to the public, and they're near real-time feeds. And they also have we have the ability to do a time-lapse caption as well. So let me see if this works. This is the Rolling Road Station project. That was only about 13 seconds. But what we're doing here, again, is providing access to the public for these various projects. And like I said, that was only about 13 seconds or so. But as you can see, work has commenced out at the Rolling Road project. And idea is to be able to capture a project from beginning to end in a time-lapse fashion, so you can see it from end to end. Also, just wanted to put up just some legislative updates. At the state level, I believe there's still expected to be a convening of the General Assembly in Richmond, I believe in August. And I'm not sure if that's been formally announced yet. Okay, it has been formally announced. So we'll be looking for that. There's we don't anticipate any legislative matters as it relates to VRE or non-budget bills. But nonetheless, we'll continue to watch that. Also, just wanted to point out that we did submit a public comment to the FOIA Advisory Council ahead of their meeting earlier this week in support of policies increasing the flexibility of VRE and similar public bodies to adopt electronic meeting policies that better accommodate the needs of their board members while remaining open, transparent, and accessible to the public. So we, like I said, we did submit that comment on that front. On the federal side, just a brief update on the transportation reauthorization bill. And as you can see, I just put a couple of bullets up here. Just to note, the Commerce bill includes $25 billion for passenger rail and $28 billion for transportation construction grants, including a $2 billion a year program to fund projects with national impact. And this bill also included $500 million annually for a new railroad crossing elimination competitive grant program. But initially, the commuter rail projects were not eligible for grants. So VRE, our staff, Joe Swartz, and our various teams worked with APTA and the Commuter Rail Coalition to secure an amendment from Senator Markey of Massachusetts, ensuring the eligibility of commuter rail transportation projects for these new highway rail crossing grants. And then under the creation of the Federal Liability Insurance Program, and I'll have to say, I'm not sure if it's intentional or not, but that acronym would be FLIP. That's not official, but just, yeah, anyway. We continue our advocacy work efforts on the House side, but language is not likely to be included in the House passed version of the INVEST Act. So our primary focus right now is in the Senate to include the full proposal language in the Senate reauthorization bill. And again, that's that issue that we have all been working on at various levels, not just within VRE, but the industry as a whole, particularly on the commuter rail side, as it relates to the limited ability to purchase excess liability, limited ability being the limited capacity in the market to purchase that. And there's some draft legislation out there that would potentially provide a federal solution for us. So at that point, that's all I have, Madam Chair. Glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton, for that report. I especially appreciated the time-lapse video, among other things. I saw Ms. Bailey had her hand raised, and then we'll go to Mr. Walkinshaw after that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dalton, thank you so much. I appreciate the time-lapse report as well. It was very interesting. I wanted to say two things. One is appreciate the great work and progression that we're making at Quantico. And just as a reminder, the Commander Bentley will be leaving us soon, transitioning out. And so if there's anything that I can do to support in that way and the work that we're doing there, please let me know. We had a tour last week with NBRC, the committee there, the military committee there. Colonel Bentley took us on a tour, and he's very pleased with the progress that we're making at Quantico. So if there's anything that I can do to assist, please let me know. I just want to let you know that things are progressing visibly quite well, as you know.
Yeah, thank you,
Ms. Bailey. Mr. Walkinshaw and then Ms. Crystal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Rich, thanks for the report. The time-lapse video is great. I love that. I have a question about page 13 of the report with the list of passenger facility projects. So Rolling Road, obviously construction has begun. We saw the time-lapse video. The chart, it looks like it's suggesting that both final design and construction are underway. So is there still design work that's taking place for the Rolling Road project simultaneous with the actual construction?
Actually, we're transitioning out of final design into construction. So,
okay.
And sometimes that chart or that report, you know, where there's a month lag, or I dare say in some cases maybe a couple month lag. So, but we'll get that. We'll make sure that that's updated. But the proof is in the video. We're constructing.
Right. Okay. Got it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dalton. Thanks for the extensive presentation. Question about the heat delays. You mentioned the implementation of the summer schedule, which I was glad to hear about. I know that was sort of one of the tactical strategies the team had thought about implementing in response to the kind of outside of our control issue with the heat restrictions. It seemed to me that although we did experience some delays, that our general on-time performance is considerably better than it's been in past years during these summer months with the heat restrictions. Is that the case, A? And if so, do you think that kind of altered summer schedule to react to the realities of the heat restrictions and their likelihood is working in that regard?
Yeah, yes. I mean, the seasonal schedule, or the way, the seasonal schedule has definitely helped. Yeah. Again, we've only got one complete year under our belt as far as the seasonal schedules, but they've definitely helped. That chart that I showed before out of the CEO report, again, those vertical bars show a 3-year rolling average. And the one thing that still kind of drags that 3-year rolling average down is, if you recall, even the months of April and May, there's still some of that PTC. I dare say that 3-letter word, but there's still some of that PTC related issues or opportunities, actually, that we had a couple of years ago. So my point is, and that's something that we're continuing to look at. Obviously, it's critical to us as a staff, and I know the operations board. We want to be able to provide, a reliable service 12 months out of the year, and that's why at the staff level and even our our contracted service providers, our host railroads, we all want to see that level off, because that's the ultimate, the ultimate goal from a complete customer service standpoint, or complete customer satisfaction standpoint, is not, it doesn't matter summer, winter, fall, spring, you should be able to rely on VRE. I will say VRE is very reliable. Unfortunately, we've had some of these events, and implementing a seasonal schedule definitely helped in more of a the systemic issue. But some of these other issues that we saw in May and again in June, they're random, and we see there's things that happen on the railroad all the time, and periodically they do happen, and we have a great way of recovering from that. And you'll see in my report next month, you'll see that we've had a week and a half in June where it's like all of those things that just randomly happen periodically over the year happened all in 1 week, and then maybe 1 week and a half. So it's a long way. Hopefully I got to the
You
answer.
did, yeah.
But,
And I think of PTC with PTSD. This couple of months back in 2019, when our on-time performance was in the 50s for about a quarter there, and so I'm glad that's behind us, and appreciate the distinction between this kind of one-off events that can sometimes cluster and the systemic issues. And so I'll just a real vote of confidence for the implementation of the summer schedule. I think if we have to sacrifice frequency of service for reliability of service, I think it's proven worth doing, because we know that our riders really do plan their day around the train. And as we heard from so many of them in 2019, when the train isn't reliable, that makes them unreliable employees, which is not an option for them. So really appreciated your point about neither rain nor sleet nor hail, or whatever the Postal Service's creed, should affect the reliability of our service.
thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Are there any other questions for Mr. Dalton? Ms. Bailey?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Yes, please. Mr. Dalton, just a quick question. In your report, you said there's a requirement for the riders to wear their mask. Is there a timeline that you have for them to not wear their mask, or are you just gonna, towards the end of the year, or what? Because everybody wants to get back to what we think is normal, which is not. But just to ask, is there a timeline?
Great question, Supervisor Bailey. Thank you. The overriding mandate for the current requirement to wear face masks on board our trains and inside our stations comes from the federal government through the Transportation Safety Administration. And their current order is set to expire on September 13th. That is to say, of course, they could rescind it or they could extend it, but that's the target date right now. And so that's what we're following. So if TSA rescinds that order or doesn't extend it on September 13th, we're likely to, not have face coverings required on board our trains any longer, unless you want to, of course.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Ms. Crystal, did you have another question?
I did not. I'm going to figure out how to lower my hand. Thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing none, we'll move on to public comments. Public comments for this meeting were taken electronically. The public comment period opened 1 week ago today and closed at 8 a.m. this morning. At this time, the clerk will read any comments into the record.
Madam Chair, there were no comments submitted.
Okay, thank you. In that case, we'll move on to our action items. 7A is an authorization to issue a maintenance services for VRE facilities task order for renovations to the VRE headquarters. Mr. Dalton, will you please introduce the item for us?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We seek authorization to issue a maintenance services for VRE facilities task order for renovations to the VRE headquarters in the amount stated in the resolution, plus a contingency for a total amount not to exceed $582,875. And of course, this is to our facility maintenance contractor, NVE Inc. And just simply, we have been doing a phased approach to renovating our headquarters location or headquarters building in Alexandria since 2016. And there's been several previous phases. And we essentially had 2 phases left that we were going to, accomplish in fiscal year 21. And what we've done is decide to just go ahead, combine those 2 phases, and subsequent to action here today, we will be prepared, or we are prepared to go and just get those renovations done. And therefore, and ahead of bringing back staff more on a full-time on or about that Labor Day weekend. So I just wanted to make that point. There was a couple more phases, we've combined it together, but so combined together, we're simply doing some conversions of workspaces to increase workspace efficiency, safety. We're creating an employee break room, modernizing our kitchen, the mail room, our supply room. We're actually creating a shower and a changing room for people, encourage folks to walk or ride their bikes to work. And that's the glamorous side of it. The non-glamorous side of the renovations is it's an old building. And this renovation finishes some rehabilitation work on mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, HVAC systems, and of course, and fire protection systems as well. And then, of course, a little bit of paint, some floor coverings, and again, our phased approach to renovating the HQ location will be completed. That's my summary, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Is there a motion and a second to approve Resolution 7A?
I move, Madam Chair.
This is Lawson. I'll second it.
Thank you. It's been moved by Ms. Bailey and seconded by Ms. Lawson. Are there any questions or comments on this item? Hearing none. All those in favor of Resolution 7A, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion passes. The next item is 7B, authorization to issue an MEC 7 task order for engineering oversight for new VRE passenger rail cars. Mr. Dalton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Seeking authorization to issue a task order under our MEC contract with STV Incorporated for engineering oversight for the new passenger rail cars in the amount stated in the resolution, plus a contingency for a total amount not to exceed $1,184,982. Just in summary, both commissions earlier this month at their respective meetings authorized the contract to purchase the new rail cars. So the next step here obviously is to put in place the required engineering oversight, and again, required by the Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Railroad Administration, and then all of our other funding partners. This is something that we've done with all of our rolling stock procurements, both rail cars and locomotives. I will point out that that somewhat different than what we've done in the past. In the past, we have just gone out there, and the time span for these can span 3, 4, 5 years. So what I've decided to do this time is, and this has been successful in similar approaches, is that this is a phased approach, which means we've taken a look at what are the requirements, what do we need the engineering oversight folks to do over the course of the next 12 months, and put the scope together. And that's what I'm subsequently seeking authorization for. We'll come back to you about this time next year and sort of lay out what that second year looks like, and there'll be a subsequent individual task order for that as well. So that's my summary, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I see Ms. Baumke has a question. Ms. Baumke, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Madam Chair. If I read this item correctly, the total contract, I believe, is like $4.5 million, but we're only authorizing for $1 million, $1.1 million for this fiscal year. So if my math is correct, it seems like for these 21 new passenger rail cars, the engineering oversight is about $203,000 per car. Would that be right?
So let me just address that. So in the background of the item, we provided some comparative information, and as you know, relative to previous rolling stock procurements, and what the 4.2 or $4.3 million that you're looking at there, that's just that's an estimate based on, you know, a percent of the total contract, and that's how we can do some very general comparisons, not only to our previous contracts, but we can do some general comparisons across the industry. Just take the total contract value, which I believe this one for the 21 rail cars is about $85 million. And again, that just gives us some comparative information. But specifically, what I'm seeking authorization for today is just the first phase at that, you know, at the 1 million plus number, and that $4.3 million number is just an estimate on what we think it could be over the 4-year period.
Right. So I appreciate that, and I understand what you're saying. I guess my question is, what are we getting for $203,000 per car? That's a lot of money for engineering oversight. Are we making massive changes to these rail cars? And if you tell me that this is worth it, and that the engineering oversight company is phenomenal, and that we get a bang for our buck for every dollar, then, you know, it just seems like it's a lot of money. But, you know, I'm new to the VRE board, so I need some help on this one, if you will.
So let me go this way. There are some very, very, very stringent requirements on an agency like us when we purchase rail cars, and those requirements are placed on us by our funding partners. And in this case, a lot of this is driven, or some of this is driven through the FTA. But a key component here is what's driven by the Federal Railroad Administration. Essentially, the engineering oversight includes having subject matter experts, if you will, in all systems, and in total vehicle design, where we go through, I'll just say, enormous amounts of reviews. We have to do our own analysis. We can't just take what the manufacturer tells us or presents to us in terms of how a system's going to perform, not just like heating and air conditioning, but braking systems. There is a tremendous amount of analysis that we have to do. And again, if you go to the background, this is based on a total contract value. This is comparative to what we've done in the past. I will say the requirements that are on us to ultimately end up certifying these rail cars are arguably second only to aircraft manufacturing. And those requirements are even more intense. So that's what we're getting for this. We're getting essentially our engineering oversight consultants to work through all of the requirements that's placed on us as an agency to verify, certify these rail cars for use in public transportation.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that additional explanation.
Thank you, Ms. Baumke, for the question, and Mr. Dalton for that explanation. I had a similar question to Ms. Baumke, although I felt better reading that the total design oversight cost is approximately 5% of the contract value, whereas it looks like the last time we purchased the gallery 4 cars, the engineering oversight was 14.5% of the cars. And Mr. Dalton, you spoke to sort of the industry standards. So it seems, and then I think for locomotives before, it was about 5% of the cost as well. So is 5% sort of the average industry standard for this?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Yes, at this point, it's about 5%. That's what our recent history, and that's what the industry is at right now. We've obviously pinged other commuter rail entities that are doing similar, either locomotive rolling stock or rail car rolling stock, and it's about 5%. I will point out that 14.5% on the initial gallery car purchase. Part of the reason why that was so high was because most of the initial research and development / certification work on those rail cars, it was done in Toyokawa, Japan. And so we had to have a team of people in Toyokawa, Japan for an extended period of time doing those certification work. With this procurement and with these rail cars, that a lot of that analysis and a lot of that on the ground type work as it relates to their manufacturing facility, that will be done in a neighboring community in Hornell, New York. So we don't have to travel quite as far on this one. So just wanted to, since you brought that up, Madam Chair, just wanted to go back and address that 14.5% cost comparison.
Got it. Great, thank you. Are there other questions or comments for Mr. Dalton?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Ms. Lawson.
thank you. I voted last month against the purchase of the rail cars. However, I obviously want them to be engineered safely and to standards, so I'll support this, but I just wanted to register my vote against the purchase last month. And Rich, I appreciate all your answers regarding the expense. I appreciate Supervisor Baumke for pressing down on that, but just wanted to remind everybody that I didn't think the purchase was proper, but obviously engineering is.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. Other questions or comments on this item? Hearing none, we do not have a motion on the table. So is there a motion and a second to approve Resolution 7B?
So move, Madam Chair. Supervisor Bailey.
Second, Supervisor Baumke.
Thank you. That's been moved by Ms. Bailey and seconded by Ms. Bonke. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion passes. The next item is 7C, a resolution to approve amendments to our bylaws and adopt an operations board electronic participation policy. Mr. Dalton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, this is, as you recall, last month, we brought this to you as an information item, had some discussion. So this is the second step in that two-step process. So we're just seeking approval of the changes that were presented and recommended, or presented last month, making that recommendation this month. And again, it's to our bylaws to adopt some changes and to implement an operations board electronic participation policy. That's my summary, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. I'm personally very excited to see these changes come forward. Is there a motion and a second to approve resolution 7C?
Move approval of the resolution, Madam Chair.
Second, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal, and I think I heard dual seconds, so we'll give that one to Mr. Alcorn. Are there any questions or comments on this item?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Ms. Bailey.
I just want to thank Mr. Dalton for the foresight, he and his team, because in this climate, we need upgrades to bylaws and policies. So thank you so much. I'm going forward to live by.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Franklin.
Sure. Yeah. Just also want to speak in support of this, and I actually want to thank you as the chair for kind of leading this effort in terms of particularly electronic participation policy, and just want to stress how important I think it is to provide flexibility through our policy. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Ms. Franklin. There are no other questions or comments. Let's see. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes. Next item is 7D, a resolution to recommend submission of the L'Enfant Station and Fourth Track project to USDOT for FY21 raise funding consideration. Mr. Dalton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you know, we do have a project, a L'Enfant Station and Fourth Track project that's in our capital improvement program. And so what we're seeking here is a recommendation to the commissions to submit an application for funding, and specifically for the planning side of this project. Currently, this project is just beginning what we call the more of a formal conceptual design phase. And as depicted on the chart here on the screen, we're in terms of development and final design costs, we have the estimates up there. And we had previously submitted a similar application to this program's predecessor program, or the build program. And we, although we were not successful, USDOT staff, they gave us some great feedback. They were very supportive of this, and frankly recommended and have supported us, kind of coming back through a similar program for the same project. So again, just as a reminder, this project is to relocate and expand with a longer platform, the L'Enfant Station, and basically be able to service that platform could be serviced by 2 full-length trains. In addition to that, there's a related 4-track project that, of course, we are closely coordinating with our partners at the Rail Authority as part of that segment, that 4-track segment going from Alexandria into or through the L'Enfant Station and into Washington Union Station. So glad to take any questions or anything you may have on this. That's my summary, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Are there questions or comments on this item?
Madam Chair, just one, Mrs. Board Member Crystal. Thank you for the presentation and very happy to support this. I wondered, Mr. Dalton, could you just say another word about that feedback that we did get from DOT as part of the build grant? You know, sometimes with federal grants, there are things beyond our control in terms of the, you know, kind of quality of the project or submission. You know, maybe the build program had different priorities and RAISE will be a better fit. But is there anything that that staff heard from that feedback that we've been able to incorporate to change the project to make it more competitive?
Thank you, Chair Crystal. So let me I guess just clarify that during the build process, again, we received good positive feedback from staff, but no planning grants. It wasn't just VRE that didn't get approved. There were no planning grants at that time. So it goes back to what you had indicated there. There were different priorities at that time. And actually, the project essentially is the same. And again, I mean, we received some feedback on some, you know, potentially some little technical type things that of course we'll incorporate or enhance in our application. But really the base project was well received, and therefore that's why, you know, we've been you know, advised that it's likely even a greater fit for the RAISE program. So.
Okay, that's great. That's really encouraging to hear. Thank you, Mr. CEO.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal, for that question. Are there other questions or comments?
Madam Chair?
Yes, is that Mr. McLaughlin?
Yeah, it is. I just want to state that the Commonwealth is supportive of this application. And as Mr. Dalton noted, it aligns with all the work we're doing with transforming rail in Virginia with CSX and VRE and Amtrak and others. So thank you for bringing this forward, Rich, and we support this this grant application.
Great, thank you. Other questions or comments? Hearing none, is there a motion and a second to approve Resolution 7D?
I move, Supervisor Bailey.
Second, Supervisor Skinner.
Thank you. It's been moved by Ms. Bailey and seconded by Mr. Skinner. All those in favor of approving the resolution, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion passes. Mr. Dalton, turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Let's just step through the information items here. 8A is the monthly spending authority report. I can answer any specific questions, but just to simply run down them, you know, we issued a purchase order to purchase inventory for the automatic passenger counter system that we recently installed in our onboard our rail cars. We issued a task order to Keolis Rail Services Virginia to remove some of the, as part of that relaxing the limitation on board our trains. We issued a task order to them to start removing, you know, the various decals and signage and stuff that we had on board our trains to help manage social distancing while we were in that limited capacity mode. We issued a task order to VHB under our GPC contract for LiDAR survey work. Speaking of the L'Enfant Station project, and so they'll go out there and do some survey work for us there. And then finally, we issued a task order to NVE to do some work at the Manassas Station parking garage. Again, if anybody has any questions there, I can get into some level of detail, but somewhat routine things. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Any questions? I see no hands. I hear no questions. Mr. Dalton, the next item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is information item 8B. Just wanted to, this is an information item to just simply publicly display on behalf of VRE our proposed disadvantaged business enterprise goals for federal fiscal years 2022 through 2024. And just as a note, we do this obviously in partnership with PRTC, and at their meeting on June 3rd, the commission's authorized them to publish the DBE goal of 14.1%. And also open up for public comment and inspection, and provisionally adopt the goal for FTA administered type contracts. So I believe we were here a couple months ago, had discussed what this goal was going to be as part of our DBE analysis report. So it shouldn't be the first time you've seen that number. But again, so this is another way of publicly displaying what that goal is. So any questions that I can answer?
Chair. Madam Chair.
Franklin, sorry, I was muted.
No problem. No, just want to comment, and Rich, if you may more explicitly explain what DBEs are just for the public, but it's a very important program that we absolutely should be striving for. Something that is important to minority communities and just various demographic groups, and so it's a program that happy to support. But Rich, maybe you talk a little bit more just so the public is aware of exactly the purpose of this program.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Franklin. So this program is to, we've established a goal to ensure participation by disadvantaged business enterprises in projects that are federally supported. I will say, absolutely, it's one of the most important things that we do from a procurement standpoint. Is to ensure that everybody across the community has an opportunity to participate in these publicly funded projects. I will say that in addition to just simply following the compliance part of this, we do a lot of outreach. Not just with PRTC, but we do a lot of outreach with the Commonwealth as well, and any of our regional partners. And that outreach includes, as you know, we do an industry day. We've partnered up with DRPT and now the Rail Authority, and we are very aggressive, if you will, at making sure that information is getting out to the DBE community, and not just getting that information out, but just making these projects and these contracts accessible. And we continue to look for creative ways, if you will, to make these projects accessible as well. So the goal is 14.1%. I will say that over the past several years, we've been in that, we've been able to attain that 11 to 12%, which is, considered relatively high, but we would like to see it higher, and we don't see a lack of opportunity to reach that 14.1%. In fact, of course, we're a very competitive staff. We want to blow past that and incorporate even higher participation. So very important program, and of course, glad to be getting this information out to the public.
Thank you, Ms. Franklin and Mr. Dalton. Certainly appreciate us wanting to surpass that goal. Any other questions or comments? Nope. Mr. Dalton, turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Final information item, 8C. So let me just set the stage here. This information item, it's again, the first part in a two-part process. We're bringing this to you. We're not asking for any action here. Just answer any questions, invite discussion. But as you recall, earlier in the year, we had discussion and subsequently led to the commission's authorizing VRE to make a bona fide offer on the purchase of land in support of the Broad Run expansion project. And it was at that time as well, we identified, the opportunity, in addition to purchasing the land, that there would be requirements upon us as it relates to the current tenants, and more specifically, federal requirements as it applies to the Federal Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisitions Policy Act, that we would be in a position where we would have to provide some assistance in the form of potentially moving expenses and other things so these businesses can relocate. And so what we have in front of you is we will come back to you next month to adopt a policy that basically says, yes, we will follow primarily the federal requirements, but we also have our eye on the state requirements as well. And they do complement each other, but I will make a note that consistent with other policies, if you will, if there's a conflict, between the federal and the state policy, then of course, as stated in the proposed policy, that we will take the course that's more advantageous to the tenant or the landowner. So that's the first piece of it. It basically says, yes, we're going to follow all the regulations through this policy. But then the second part of this involves us as an organization having a specific process in the event that, say we after we sit down and we interview the tenants and basically look at their needs and stuff like that, and we essentially make an offer in terms of relocation assistance. And of course, we have to have a process where that tenant can come back and say, essentially go, nah, we don't like that, right? So it's a relocation appeals process that's somewhat or is specific to VRE. And so that spells out the majority, if you will, of the detail as part of the attachment that you have for this information item. So I will say that in addition to our project team, of course, our recently officially appointed general counsel and chief legal officer, Mr. Steve McIsaac, has been obviously working very hand in hand with our real estate consultant, who will be essentially managing our way through that. So, and I know he's here today, so if you have any questions for me or our chief legal officer, we'll take those now, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Questions for Mr. Dalton or Mr. McIsaac, or comments?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Bailey.
Yeah, it's the Webex again. We're learning everything. But I wanted to ask, and this may be a question that cannot be answered right now, but when we talk about displaced business owners, properties in that regard, and persons, do we know if there's a majority of businesses rather than properties, landowners or homes or whatever? Do we know that yet, or is that a part of the process?
So let me try it this, or let me respond here, and then if I don't quite get the answer to your question, Supervisor Bailey, please prod me a little bit. But this process, now that we have made a bona fide offer, essentially the next step, at least in the process for relocation, is to be able to meet with, and we have to coordinate this through the current landowner, be able to meet with the tenants and, you know, and understand their business a little bit. At this point, you know, we've made some assumptions, and so over the course of the next 6 to 9 months, as our real estate consultant team goes in and meets with these tenants, we'll have a lot more information. And I will just say that at a point where we have been able to pull the entire analysis together, we will come back to the operations board. Obviously, we're not going to take any actions or make any offers, but we'll come back to the operations board and give you very specific detail of who the tenants are, what type of businesses they are, and frankly, what they are entitled to in terms of relocation benefits. So it's early in that process, and I can only, you know, can just give you a really high level stuff right now. So.
No, that answers my question, Mr. Dalton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Other questions or comments? We will, of course, be talking about this again next month, so thank you. I don't hear anything else, so we'll move to the next item, which is board member comment. Does anyone have any comments they'd like to share? If not, that's okay too. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We've been kind of hanging fire on this executive session to discuss a project with the state. And I communicated with Rich last night. I'm wondering if we should not be taking the time, while we have the time, instead of waiting for a decision, of discussing what VRE would like to see coming out of this project. From the standpoint of, one, I agree we have a great working relationship with the state. I can tell you I've been on this board when we have not had a great working relationship with the state. We have now changing dynamics in who we will be dealing with in the future on commuter rail, and congratulate Mike on his move. The state also is obviously looking beyond commuter rail on a much broader scale with rail, which potentially could impact this organization and funding in the future. And I think it would be worthwhile, if we're continuing to go down this road, that there be some discussion at this board, because everything that will be involved in this is a negotiation, or should be a negotiation. And I think it's imperative that we have some discussion at some point of what we as a board will expect moving forward before we make any future commitments to any changes at the state level. And I will just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I think appreciate the comments, and certainly at this point, I think can talk to staff about scheduling that conversation for the next meeting.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Franklin.
And I'll just say very quickly to add to Mr. Kelly, I know we're going to speak soon about the legislative committee, so perhaps that's a discussion we can maybe start there. So happy to further that dialogue.
Thank you, Ms. Franklin. I see Mr. Banks also has his hand raised.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this question is for Rich. It's budget time, and my governing body noticed that the local subsidies were reduced, and they asked, I know it's a result of federal legislation, but will it continue next year as well?
Oh, thanks for the question, Mr. Banks. So the action that we took and resulting in action at the commission level was to simply reduce the jurisdictional subsidy for fiscal year 22. Okay, so that's the action that has been taken. We will likely have this as a topic as we as we begin our fiscal year 23 discussions. And I don't want to be presumptuous on the outcome. I just want to say that this will be a topic through the FY23 discussion as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. I see Ms. Bonke has her hand raised as well.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Kind of tagging along to what Mr. Kelly mentioned, my question would be, timing is everything. Do we need to have a special board meeting prior to the next board meeting in light of this whole conversation? Because I don't want to be put in a position, and I'm not familiar with all the conversations that are taking place, but I don't want to be put in a position where we get information and then we have to vote on it immediately. Because I don't think that's good for us or for the public process or good for us long term. So that's my question.
Madam Chair, if you don't, let me just assure you, Supervisor Bonke, we would never put you in a position where you have to make a decision without ample time to analyze any type of information. So just rest assured there. But I just want to respond to that, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton.
Madam Chair.
Is that Ms. Lawson?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Meg, I appreciate your question, your comment, because I was feeling and thinking the same way. So Rich, I appreciate the reply. That makes me feel a little bit better about going into next month.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. Any other comments?
Madam Chair.
Ms. Bailey.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all of you that are on the CEO Evaluation Committee for your responses and your participation. I really appreciate it. And just know that we are in that season, and you will get information from Anna and myself going forward. And thank you, Rich, for all that you do. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. And thank you for your leadership of the CEO Evaluation Committee. Any other comments? Okay, before we adjourn, or before I ask for a motion to adjourn, I will remind everyone there is a Finance Committee meeting after this. Anyone is welcome to stay in addition to those members on the committee. And obviously our next meeting will be in person at PRTC on July 16th. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey.
Second, Supervisor Bonke.
Thank you, Ms. Bonke. All those in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstentions? Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Madam Chair, are you still there?
I am, yes.
I don't want to be confused. This is the finance meeting that's coming up.
That's correct, yes.
Is the legislative meeting today as well? I was trying to catch Supervisor Franklin.
That's in July.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So this is Mr. Schofield. Good morning, everyone. I think we'll just go directly into the committee as long as everyone is ready to go. Ms. Bonke, you're the chair. Do you want to lead us off with any comments?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Mr. Schofield. So I just want to welcome everybody to the Finance Committee meeting. We hope that this will be about a 45-minute meeting, but it really depends on questions. We have 2 items to really focus on today. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark to make some introductions with PFM. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bonke. Yes, you're exactly right. We do have 2 items on the agenda today. The first is talking about the funding agreement that we have with the Commonwealth, with DRPT and VPRA, that will ultimately be leading to the issuance of VROC-backed debt. And then the second item is a preview of the FY23 budget process. So I will be taking the lead on the budget item, but we do have a special guest here with us to talk about the funding agreement and the debt. So Joanne Carter is Managing Director at PFM. Joanne and PFM have been the financial advisor for VRE for many years. If you don't know Joanne directly through VRE, you may know her from her work with a number of other jurisdictions in Northern Virginia and around the Commonwealth. She and her team have assisted us over the years on everything from doing the financial planning for our 2040 system plan to the recent refinancing of our railcar debt. And she and her team led the original development of our debt and financial management principles back in 2013. And that's sort of a key first step here for our new debt issuance. So we couldn't really be in better hands for going through this debt issuance. With that, I will turn it over to Joanne. She will sort of lead the majority of the presentation, but she and I will both be available then to do the Q&A and to talk about what comes next. So Joanne, please.
Great. Thank you, Mark. That was a very kind and fulsome introduction. I'm glad it's being recorded for my parents who still like to watch me on YouTube do these things. So good morning. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I see the presentation is up, so thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in because Mark took care of all of the formalities. If we want to thank you, go to slide 2. About 8 years ago, it is true, I was here working with VRE and the operations board to set up a new set of financial and debt management principles. And as you all know, every year you see these items in your budget that you adopt in your operating and capital budget. And there's a copy of these in the read ahead materials that were sent to you in the appendix of this presentation if you'd like to refer to them. So when these principles or policies, I'll use that word interchangeably here, were initially adopted, the items that you see here on this slide were the objectives that we discussed for setting the principles in the first place. And as many of you are probably familiar, when you develop debt and financial policies for the first time, you're looking for them to be a balance of many different things. And sometimes those things stand in contrast to one another. So for example, it's always important for debt policies to be very clear and understandable, both for you all as a governing body, as well for the staff and for the many stakeholders you have, whether that's the rating agencies, the member jurisdictions themselves. But you also need them to be flexible enough to meet the needs of the organization, both in the short and the long term. So as we look to expand your existing policies to prepare for the leveraging of the CROC funds, these underpinnings that you see here will continue to be a foundation for the exercise ahead of us. Next slide, please. So the existing, I'll call them 2013 policies, cover various areas. They pertain to your debt, they pertain to liquidity and reserves. They also cover other areas of financial management across the VRE enterprise. And at the time that we developed these back in 2013, we really did look to VRE's then existing debt and the legal structure of that debt to inform the debt policies that are embedded in the principles. And at that time, VRE's debt consisted of bonds that had been sold through NVTC back in 1997 to initially fund the system. That's what you see here in the blue box. And that debt was secured by the revenue collected under the master agreement. So that includes fares as well as the jurisdictional subsidies. So that debt has an inherent backstop, if you will, of the member jurisdictions. Also at that time, VRE had a loan outstanding from the FTA. It financed some rail cars through a program known as RIF. And as you just heard from Mark, we refinanced that in 2018. And that debt is now was lent to us through the Virginia Resources Authority, which is a state program. So that's what you see there in the orange. So it's this initial, your existing debt, which you see here in the boxes at the bottom of the slide, is all secured by the operations of the master agreement. And that is going to be completely separate from the new debt that will be incurred. So now that VRE has a new funding source through CROC and the authority to issue bonds backed by CROC, we need to use some of the existing principles, but also create some new principles that will apply to the CROC debt, given that that's going to be separate and unique from your existing debt. Next slide, please. So in general, revisiting debt policies and practices over time to reflect changes in your organization, to reflect changes in the marketplace and other circumstances, in and of itself is a best practice. As Mark said, I've worked with many of you in your home communities to do exactly this over the years. And so doing it now makes good, prudent sense, given that VRE is preparing to leverage these funds. So what we'll be doing is developing both new policies, but also using some of the existing policies, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to apply to the CROC debt. But first, I wanted to give you a sense of what that CROC debt is likely to look like. First of all, it'll be a brand new legal and credit structure, so there will be all new legal documents. The rating agencies, when they look at the CROC debt, will look at this debt differently and use different criteria to rate it than they do use for the criteria of your existing debt. And also it will be criteria that's different from any of the debt that you all have in your home communities and that you're probably familiar with. This debt will be paid solely from CROC revenues. There will be no support from the member jurisdictions, no backstop or credit support from the Commonwealth, and the existing VRE revenue will be totally separate and segregated. So this is all CROC-backed debt. Next slide, please. So given that, when we develop new policies or principles that will apply to the CROC debt, there will be some different approaches that we take, and those are described here on this slide. First, of course, the CROC principles will be consistent with the debt authorization in the statute. There are some limitations on how much debt you can incur, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The CROC-backed debt principles will also reflect provisions that are in the funding agreement with DRPT, and we'll also be developing them in a way to support investment-grade credit ratings. And this will include having various features to secure the debt, including things like reserves, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then we'll also develop what I'll call an affordability metric. And this is to ensure that the CROC revenue is not over-leveraged and that you don't incur debt that can't ultimately be afforded by the revenue going to the CROC fund. Next slide, please. So we've begun working with Mark and his team to develop new CROC policies and to examine which of your existing policies should and could continue to apply. For the ones that exist today that are broad in nature and that we think will apply to CROC, there are a handful. I've noted two here at the top of this slide. The first one, Policy Statement 9, puts a limit on how long debt can be outstanding. And basically it's tied to the useful life of the asset being financed. That's a good universal common sense approach to any sort of borrowing. It's typical for tax exempt debt, and so it will absolutely apply going forward to the CROC debt. Policy Statement 13 is one that says that VRE will limit the use or it discourages the use of variable rate debt. The reason for that is that variable rate debt carries certain risks that you as a borrower would not have with fixed rate debt. And so we think this is another good principle to carry forward. To the extent we determine that might be in your best interest, there's a process here for making sure we put additional protections in, policies and procedures to mitigate against the risks that come with using variable rate debt. And then in the bottom of the slide, I've listed 2 proposed provisions that would be specific to the CROC backed debt. The first one would be a policy that debt service coverage, which is the ratio of annual CROC debt to annual CROC debt service, would not be less than 1.60 times. And that policy threshold would be set for kind of 2 purposes. One is to ensure that you always stay within the statutory requirement that is provided for the CROC debt, which is that the debt service cannot exceed 66% of the CROC revenue. And it also is set at a level that the rating agencies will look at and see that the bonds can be rated investment grade or better. So it kind of reflects those 2 things together. The second new proposed policy would be to set up and maintain a debt service reserve fund. And this is a fund that's there in case there's ever a disruption to the CROC revenue. You know, these bonds will be outstanding for many years, perhaps as long as 30 years. And so this just gives investors comfort that if something ever happens over the course of those years, there's, you know, a place to go to fund the debt service if needed for some limited period of time. I will tell you that this feature is pretty common for new credits. When we set up the initial issuance of the NVTA bonds back in 2014, it had a debt service reserve fund. We're working today with EDOT to put together a new borrowing program for their I-81 corridor program, and those bonds are expected to have some reserves. So it's a pretty common feature for a new credit. And I'll say it's a feature that you've had embedded in your existing debt for many, many years.
Joanne, this
Next
is
slide.
Supervisor Baumke.
Yes, ma'am.
What are you typically looking at right now for the percentage of the debt service reserve fund?
So for bonds that have tax exemption, there is an IRS limit that basically they say that limits how much you can put into that reserve fund. And the limit is no more than 10% of the total amount borrowed, generally. And so that's what we're looking at, is we're looking to that limitation that generally exists for the debt service reserve fund. There are some other metrics that we might look at. We might look at maximum annual debt service. And then there's another metric that is often looked at, 125% of average annual debt service. And so we might look at those 3 levels and we will default to the lowest one. That's what the IRS requires us to do.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Next slide, please. Okay. So as I said, the drafting of the policies is underway, and our expectation is to bring them forward for formal consideration next month. Since the CROC debt will be a new structure, there's obviously some analysis we need to do to sort of put a framework of what that might look like together to inform the policies. When we wrote the debt policies in 2013, we had an existing debt base, we had a legal framework, we had a credit framework, and so it was, you know, those things were known. Here, obviously, they're not. So it's a bit of an iterative process to sort of put the policies together, which is what this graph or the graphic here is intended to illustrate. And the way we'll go about it is, you know, the first thing that we put together as a foundation is the legal and the credit features. And that, of course, will be consulting with VRE's legal counsel as well as your bond counsel. And then those features will drive the potential credit ratings that we may get on the CROC bonds. And we'll go through a process that we call a credit assessment, where basically we look at the rating agency's criteria, we match them up with what we expect or what we think the structure of the bonds will be to determine where we think the rating will come out. And then, of course, we are a financial advisor, so we like our models. We will have some financial models that will look at various financing options, and we'll sort of work our way across all these activities to inform the ultimate policies that we bring to you for consideration. Next slide, please. So what we're doing now, as Mark said, is we're working through the policies first, and then we'll continue through the initial financial planning phase, which is what you see on the left side of the slide in the orange, to continue to look at the modeling. We'll look at the credit assessment and various techniques. So that's underway. We'll work on that through the summer, wrapping up in the fall. And then at the end of that process, we'll have all the information available for VRE to decide as to the best financing technique to use to provide funds for the TRV initiative. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, the blue boxes, that would be the actual implementation of the financing. Those are sort of the steps that you would typically move through. They vary a little bit depending upon what sort of financing method you choose. And then at the end of that process, you would have funds available to make VRE's contribution for transforming rail in Virginia. So that concludes my prepared remarks. I am thankful for your attention and very happy to address any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanne. Any questions for Joanne?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Mr. Kelly.
this might be Mark and or Joanne. I just need a quick refresher first. Understand CROC is coming out of our gas tax funds locally to fund this. Now, when the state made this, and we can debate whether or not we felt this was a good way to do it, that's a set amount that comes out of the gas tax funds, not a percentage. Is that correct, Mark?
That is correct.
Okay, so the concern I have, a little bit of a concern I have, is one, the commitments we're already making and potentially going to make with our CROC funds over the next few years. And understanding that CROC funds are based on fuels tax, which we just had a conversation with our friends in Richmond who are setting up their own transportation authority, and everybody realizing that fuel tax revenues for transportation over the next 10 or 15 years, and we're talking long bond times, is probably going to plummet, if not totally change that dynamic on which the funding is going to be based. What kind of impacts are we going to see, both with regards to using these funds in the future, when the dynamics for the funding itself is probably in question? Both from the standpoint of, obviously, we would need to, I would assume, to move forward to get some commitment out of the state that money will be there regardless of what happens, but also understand for some of the smaller jurisdictions, that loss of funds and this commitments that we're making now is going to have an impact on our abilities to deal with some of this. So what are we looking at happening in the future in regards to, one, the commitments we have made, are considering now, and understanding that the source of funding is not the most stable in the world?
I'll go first, and then I'll ask Joanne to jump in. As far as our near-term commitments that we've made to certain projects like the LaFont project and the Crystal City project, we essentially have those EROC funds in hand. They are in the bank. So we'll be able to follow through on those commitments. We don't have any other outstanding capital project commitments as of yet. We are basically prepared to use the next 10 years of this EROC on this commitment to TRV, with the understanding that half of that then will come back and be available to us at the end of the 10 years. So I don't think we're overcommitted at the moment. I think your question about sort of long-term gas taxes and how is the market viewing that, Joanne, correct me if I'm wrong, but the I-81 project is based on gas taxes, right? Have you had discussions?
Yes.
Are you able to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. No. The question of what happens to fuels tax-backed bonds is very current in the marketplace, and hopefully by the end of the summer here, we will have that I-81 transaction in the marketplace, and everyone will be able to see the outcome there. I expect it will be favorable. I think to the question of how do you manage and how is the market viewing the long-term trajectory of fuels tax-backed debt, and how does that come home to roost, if you will, with the CROC debt is, the margin of coverage that we talk about both legally for these bonds as well as inside your policy will be really important, because not over leveraging this stream will be part of how the VRE manages how that risk settles with inside the CROC fund, but also that long-term risk is getting transferred to bondholders, basically. So bondholders who buy this bond, they'll understand, we will properly disclose where the money comes from, and they will make a judgment about buying the bonds based on that risk and the level of debt that could potentially be incurred. So that risk does get transferred off to bondholders is how it will occur, and they'll make judgments. But I think it's fair to say, notwithstanding all the expected pressures on fuels tax-backed bonds, it's still a marketable structure. Investors, long-term investors, institutional investors are still buying bonds that are fuels tax-backed, and they understand the risk. So I do think this is an evolving area, and we'll keep an eye on it. But I think initially, for what we're trying to do in the next six months or so to leverage the CROC monies, we will be able to do that to good effect.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I have a couple questions. When you talked about the useful life of the trains, being somewhat new to VRE, what is the useful life of a train these days? Is that 20 years, 30 years, or something in between?
Yeah, so I was referring, I'm sorry, Mark, did you want to take that? Okay, I'll bring it back to you. Yeah, so what I was referring to was the initial financing that was done for rail cars, which, gosh, I want to say that those were done, that RIF loan was probably done in, let's see, we refinanced in 18, so it must have been done in 07 or 08, if memory serves. Thank you, Mark. And those bonds will reach their final maturity in 2032. So we have about 10 more years to go on that financing. Mark, if you'd like to speak to the current state of useful life of rail cars, I think you're in a better position to address that.
I'm sorry, I don't remember right off the top of my head what the FTA's designation of the useful life is, but I believe it's on the order of 25 to 30 years. Thank you, Rich. 30 years.
Okay, all right, thank you. So also tagging on to a couple things that Mr. Kelly asked, in light of the gas tax revenues potentially plummeting or decreasing, can you give me an idea of, when you're looking at the bond market, are you seeing in the debt issuance for the I-81 corridor, are you looking more at 80% institutional investors and 20% individual bondholders, or based on working with the bond market, what are you anticipating with that particular issuance as far as the makeup of the bond purchasers?
Sure. Thank you. So I think what I will expect is that issue will likely be placed primarily with institutional investors. The reason for that will primarily be less about the credit that's supporting the bonds, but more about the current state of interest rates in the bond market. Notwithstanding the fact that we've seen interest rates start to inch up here over the beginnings of the summer, interest rates on municipal bonds continue to be low enough that they are not very attractive to retail investors. So we're seeing retail investors compose a very, very small part of our primary offerings these days. And institutional investors, the bond funds, insurance companies, what have you, they're primarily the dominant players in the muni market. And that varies, of course, month to month, day to day. But my expectation is that institutional investors will be by far the largest component of the borrowers for that issue, as well as for CROC backed debt.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. That's helpful. And then one last question for I-81, and I don't know the makeup of that transaction, but realizing it's backed by gas taxes, what rating are you all anticipating for that project? And would you be anticipating a similar rating for the CROC backed funds?
Yeah, so I expect that the I-81 bonds will be rated comfortably investment grade. You know, it's many of the communities that are members of VRE, the Commonwealth itself, you're all used to seeing 3 AAAs or triple AAAs. It's not going to be there, but it will be a very, you know, attractively rated bond. We're not at the point yet where that information is available. So if you sense that I'm hesitating a little bit, that's why. And then in terms of the CROC ratings, the credit assessment process that I described, we are just now kicking that off. And so I don't want to get ahead of that and put something out there. But my expectation is that CROC rate debt, given, you know, an assumption about what the structure would look like, should be single A credit or better.
Okay. And Mark, when the I-81 rating comes out, could you please let us know as soon as you hear about that, and maybe get us a copy of the prospectus or anything regarding the disclosures in the official statement? Because I'd like to look at the cash flow analysis of how that was determined and the makeup and everything.
I will certainly do that. I know that Joanne and her team are keeping us, you know, right up to date on that one and how it may impact ours. So.
Because I think that the devil's in the detail, and that's the main thing that the rating agencies are focusing on this type of a transaction. So I think the cash flows would be paramount. So, okay, that's all I have. Anybody else have any additional questions? Mr. Kelly.
Can I do a follow-up? You just brought up an interesting point, and I want to follow up on it. Obviously not an expert on the bond market. I think one of the reasons that the difference between what an I-81 bond will be and a CROC bond will be is I would assume most investors are going to look at that and go, the Commonwealth of Virginia is not going to let that stand if something were to happen, that they will at some point intervene. That's got to be in the back of everybody's mind. That's not necessarily the case with us and the CROCs and anything that we do, unless we do get some type of support from the state and back in. I mean, I've sat in enough meetings where we're told that EDA bonds and others, that we as a locality are not responsible for them, but everybody tells you in the back room, boy, if you let that EDA bond go bad, it's badly reflects on you. It's going to affect your credit ratings and everything else like that. So if something really bad happens, while you're not legally obligated to intervene, you are, to protect your own bond ratings, better intervene. Is that a legitimate point to make?
Well, I think the matter of credit backstop for both I-81 and CROC is the same in that there will be no recourse to other funds. You know, and this is actually true of the NVTA bonds that are out there. And then the sister organization in Hampton Roads, HR TAC, which has both sales and gas tax, fuel tax backed bonds as well. You know, there is a fund, revenue goes into the fund, and those revenues are what investors can look to, full stop, to be repaid. That's a little bit different than EDA subject to appropriation bonds. Those bonds are a lot closer to your general obligation credit than the types of bonds that we're talking about for CROC, for I-81, for NVTA, for HR TAC, and maybe CVTA if they decide to leverage their funds. So those types of bonds, the CROC bonds, what we're talking about, they're a type of bond called a, Standard & Poor's calls them a priority lien bond. They're sometimes colloquially called special tax bonds. We tend to not have those at the local level in Virginia for kind of reasons embedded in our Constitution, but in other states, they're very common. They're common in states like Florida, Colorado, Pennsylvania. There are where this concept of identifying a specific tax or basket of taxes, pledging those taxes to repay the debt with no backstop to the issuer. This is a relatively new concept in Virginia, but it's fairly common in other places, and it is viewed, investors do view it as standalone credit without credit support from, the issuer or the issuing members if it's an authority. And many investors learned through the pandemic that if they had a sales tax-backed bond from an issuer in Florida or an issuer in Louisiana, where there's high dependency on tourism, that they could see their source of repayment take a pretty steep hit. So I think the investors are pretty attuned to what the pledge is and what the pledge isn't. And they've all recently been quite schooled that they shouldn't assume that someone's going to come in and rescue them if their pledge is a particular stream of revenue.
If I just an example, so we've run into that situation, even I-81, and we say, you know what, you guys took a chance. We're not backing it. We're not going beyond this. So I sincerely doubt the state would not intervene. How does that affect future bond issuances? I would assume that would have a massive impact on, there are so many things that can go potentially south that I cannot see where somebody would not come in and back it at certain levels. And I've got to believe that most anybody who is involving in a state project is not going to expect the state to make sure it happens. But again, the state has that ability. CROC doesn't. You're right, we don't. I'm a little leery, again, going back to the whole gas tax revenue. And again, for me, it goes beyond just a bonding issue. It's a source of revenue that is shrinking, and it's going to continue to shrink, which means more of Fredericksburg's dollars will continue to maintain the CROC amount that we've committed to making under what the state did to us. And then, we're sitting here in Fredericksburg, unlike the bigger communities, and I've had this conversation a lot with my colleagues. I realize if you're a Fairfax County and you're a Stafford County or Prince William County, this is not a big deal for you. For us in the city of Fredericksburg, it's a huge deal. And I understand we got to put these policies in place. I'm just kind of looking at the reality and some of the things that we've run into as a city, just having through a number of conversations with bondings for baseball stadiums and with EDAs and other things. And every time in every situation being told, well, yeah, you're not legally obligated to intervene, but if you don't, that is going to have significant impacts on your locality if you do not do so. So just throwing that out there.
Madam Chair, could I chime in with just maybe one other perspective from serving on the NVTA and the finance committee of the NVTA in particular? I think, those are all very real and fair considerations. I suppose what I wanted to say from sort of the experience of, as Joanne was mentioning, right, one of these entities between NVTA and HR TAC that has some experience with reliance on regional funding streams. That it generally, I think, Joanne could certainly speak better than I could about the way investors approach it, but for all of us, the point is not so much in terms of the sort of fiscal health or responsiveness of the expenditures or the bonds. It's less about who backstops this and more about what are your practices to avoid over leveraging that funding stream. I suspect that's what, as Joanne was mentioning, about what investors themselves look for. And so what is so much more important, I think, in practice is that we focus on what are the right principles, exactly what this presentation was intended to do, to ensure that we are not, or the Commonwealth, in partnership with us in CROC, are not relying on overly optimistic or projections about the way things have always been with gas taxes, and finding ourselves far too stretched in the amount of debt that can actually be backed with this revenue source. And so all of which is to say, like, I think it's right to we should catastrophize, right, and think about the worst case scenario. But I actually think the thing that is so much more important, at least from the NVTA experience, and I'd argue here, is what are the practices to put, as many guardrails as possible on a circumstance in which the collateral, so to speak, the taxation is insufficient to pay back the bonds. Like, let's prevent that from ever happening. That's the more important work to be done, rather than figuring out, well, who's left holding the bag, or who might we hope would be stepping in, or whose financial reputations might suffer if we were over leveraged and couldn't pay back CROC backed debt from the CROC revenue sources.
Katie, I do not disagree with anything you just said.
Yeah.
The only thing that I find amazing is we have now, and for all of us that have been involved in transportation for a little bit of time, have been talking about the failure of looking at motor fuels tax for handling transportation, yet we continue to come up with policies and procedures involving in the use of motor fuels tax. And it's just amazing to me that we just continue down this road. I mean, we had the representative from the Richmond, their new transportation authority, and they're heavily reliant on the gas tax. We asked them, when you're looking at projects that you've got to fund 20 or 30 years out, knowing how things are changing, did you continue to do this? And they're still scratching their heads. It's just, again, it's more of a principle thing with me than anything else.
I think it's a fair point, and I'll say at the authority level, there is a little bit more diversity in the funding sources, right? Some of that funding also comes from the grantor's tax and the transient occupancy tax, additional increments that are levied on the Northern Virginia jurisdictions in NVTA. I don't know what it would even look like, whether we'd even recommend it, right? This could be a good question for Mark to lobby for, a change in code to allow for a greater diversity of funding sources comprising the CROC. That might be reasonable for all of the reasons you've described.
So thank you. I think this is really good, healthy conversation, looking at the pros and the cons and the what ifs. And I think PFM will be critical in this whole kind of makeup of what our revenue analysis looks like and our disclosure statement. And but I do think that this is a good conversation to have with the Finance Committee. Mark, do you have anything to add here, or Joanne?
Why don't I let Joanne go first if she's got any last comments?
No, thank you very much.
Okay. I will reiterate what I think Joanne said as far as the timeline. We are looking to come back to the operations board next month in July with a proposal to have the updated policies that incorporate everything that we need in order to move ahead with this CROC-backed debt. We do not have an operations board meeting in August. Joanne and her team and I, we will be working over the summertime, doing those initial planning steps, the credit assessment, all of the cool modeling that they do, all of those iterative steps that she talked about. And then we anticipate coming back sometime in the fall to the committee and to the board with a recommendation on a path to go forward. So that is where we stand.
Okay, I do have one last question for Joanne. Is this transaction perhaps too big to be a private placement?
You could. It wouldn't be my first recommendation. I think this is absolutely a transaction that will be well received in the capital markets, which I think would get you the best execution. frankly, because you can access a broader array of potential investors, institutional, across the board, as opposed to, a single placement. I think my expectation is there's no reason for this to be in $100,000 denominations, which is what would be required for a private placement. This can, look just like, $5,000 denoms and, a nice capital markets transaction, assuming that's the best approach. I mean, we will look at other approaches as well, for whatever is the most cost effective, but I don't think it would be necessary to go down the private placement approach.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think now we're ready for our next item, Mark, on the kickoff of the budget.
Okay, and I will say thank you again to Joanne. If you want to stay and listen about the budget, you're certainly welcome, but I don't think you have to.
Thank you, Joanne. We appreciate you being with us.
Okay, so I know we ran a little bit long there on the debt item, so I will try to move quickly here through the FY23 budget item. So this is sort of a preview of a preview. If you'll just jump ahead to our process or our timeline here, we will be, those of you who have been around for a few years know how this budget timeline goes. We will come before the operations board next month with a formal discussion of our key issues for the FY23 budget adoption. So the work that we're doing here today is sort of a preview of those key issues. Then in September, we will present the preliminary budget. We will have a lot of sort of iterative back and forth refinements in October and November. And then in December, the operations board will hopefully approve the budget and refer it to the commissions for their approval in early January. So we are right at the beginning of the process. I did sort of jump over the agenda. Sorry about that. The topics that I really want to cover today, looking ahead to 23, are recovery out of the pandemic, all the different dimensions of that. Talk a little bit about TRV and how TRV is going to play into the budget, and then just a little bit of sort of a grab bag of some other issues. I really want to encourage the committee members to feel free to ask questions. I really want to encourage your feedback. If there are issues that you think need to be raised that are not here on the screen or in the discussion, please raise those. So coming out of the pandemic, we have a long way to go, but the trend is in the right direction. We're going to obviously be watching the return of ridership very closely over the coming months. But we'll start actually here on this slide with understanding where we are with the various pandemic relief funds that we've gotten out of the federal government. So in this chart, we have those three major relief acts: CARES, CRISA, and the American Rescue Plan. With the total funding there in that gray box of almost $275 million, we do have to set aside a little bit of that for security investments. But then what we have is, the $3 million that Dwight mentioned that we actually drew in the fourth quarter of 2020. Our estimated draw, basically entirely for the backfill of lost passenger revenue in the current year that is just about to end, 2021, so about $28 million there. And then, as we noted in the amended budget that the commissions passed earlier this month, approximately $54 million of pandemic funds being used in the FY22 budget. That is a combination of, again, backfill for expected lost passenger revenue. It is the subsidy relief that we have been able to give to the jurisdictions that Rich was talking about earlier. And it is not seeking reimbursement on our track access fees in 22. So you put all those things together, and then we have a placeholder for some of the strategic investments that we've talked about potentially using the relief funds for. But even when you put all of those things together, that will use up all the CARES Act funds, essentially use up all the rescue plan funds, but still leave a significant amount of funding out of CRISA. So again, we feel confident that in the short term, that VRE can continue to provide the level of service that's expected, and continue to be ready to accept passengers when they're ready to come back to us. So let's talk about those return of passengers. Compared to the amended budget that we did for FY21, we are seeing a bit of a slower return of passengers than we had originally hoped. We again hope to continue to see that ridership growing over the summertime, but don't expect to see that significant bump back up until Labor Day, until schools are open, and many of the agencies and companies really begin to have people coming back to the office. What we're still waiting to see is what kind of changes in commuting patterns we see. And that's going to show up in two ways. It's going to show up in how many total riders do we have on any given day, week, month, but also what type of tickets are those riders purchasing. And that shows up sort of mechanically in what's our average fare. How much are people paying on average to take a trip on VRE? Before the pandemic, we were averaging roughly 19,000 riders a day. They were on average paying about $9 a trip. What we have budgeted for FY22 is about 6,000 riders a day. And if you'll recall, the hope there is that it's going to start low, end high, but across the course of the year be about 6,000 riders a day at about $12 a trip. So that is a combination of, or I should say that's primarily people using monthly pass products, but maybe not traveling as much as they were in the past. What we're seeing right now, again, just for comparison, if you look at the last month of May, is about 1,800 riders a day at an average fare of about $14 a trip. So we certainly don't, that average fare per trip has been coming down over the months as people's travel behavior has sort of normalized, and people who are not riding have finally stopped buying tickets, things like that. We don't expect it to stay at $14. We expect that to continue to come down. Where it actually ends up, does it go all the way back down to sort of the pre-pandemic normal of $9? Does it stay higher? Hard to say. That's something that we're going to be watching very closely. But just this is sort of some easy math here. For every 1,000 daily riders that we have, normally, at least in the pre-pandemic world, that's worth about $2 million a year in passenger revenue. So if we were to go, say, from 17,000 riders a day to 18,000 riders a day on average, that would give us another $2 million of revenue over the course of the year. So if you can just if that's an easy little nugget that you can just sort of keep in mind, that could be helpful. When Ms. Baumke and I were talking about this meeting earlier, one thing that she had asked was to sort of give some parameters on the projection. What do we think we might see? Not that we can yet put any sort of probabilities on this. We don't know where we're going to land, but what might things look like? So I've given sort of three examples here. If we were to make a 90% recovery in terms of our average daily ridership, say roughly 17,000 trips, and we kept that same average fare as before the pandemic, we'd be seeing a revenue gap relative to where we would have expected to be of about $5 million. Go down a notch. Suppose we made a 75% recovery so that we were averaging 14,000 riders, but perhaps the average fare increases a bit by 10% because people are maybe riding less, but they're continuing to use a monthly pass. Then we would see a revenue gap of about $9 million. And then if you go one step below that, suppose we only made it in 23, suppose we only made a 60% recovery back to sort of our pre-pandemic normal, that would be about 11,000 riders a day. And suppose that we were at our sort of normal average fare, then we'd be looking at a much more substantial revenue gap of about $18 million. So we're going to be having to weigh all of these things, watching how the return of ridership happens in order to sort of get a gauge of what kind of a gap are we potentially looking at, how much are we going to potentially have to dip into those remaining amounts of the pandemic relief funds. Tied into all this, of course, is the sort of normal policy decisions that pre-pandemic were sort of paramount in the budget development, and that is the level of passenger fares and also the amount of the jurisdictional subsidy. And this was a question that Mr. Banks had raised earlier in the meeting. On the question of fares, we're certainly seeing a lot of discussion among the local bus agencies, WMATA, looking at potentially both permanent changes to their fares, permanent lowerings of their fares, and also sort of temporary or promotional things that they could do, maybe have a ride on Fridays for free or something like that. We will absolutely be looking at those kinds of opportunities. We will absolutely be looking at marketing and other kinds of promotional things in order to bring riders back. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, we have been an agency that has been built on a relatively high recovery out of the fare box. Fares are critical to sort of our long-term sustainability, to our sort of prudent fiscal management. So I don't think that we'll be sort of, at least in the near term, moving away from that sort of a basis for the financial health of the agency. I think our initial view going into 23 is that we will hold the fares where they are at their current levels. At least that's likely to be the proposal in the preliminary budget. We don't want to raise fares in an environment like this when we're trying to bring passengers back, but we also don't want to give up that important source of revenue. And then the other side of the coin then is the jurisdictional contribution. And as we talked about, we were able to provide relief for the upcoming year for fiscal 22, at least for the operating portion of the subsidy, which is about 3/4 of the total. And this is one area in particular, given conversations that Ms. Baumke and I have had, given the comment from Mr. Banks, that I would certainly like to hear you all's comments. My sense has been that the local revenue picture continues to improve, and my sense from looking at what is likely to be our return of ridership is that we would generally tend in 23 to reserve the pandemic relief funds in order to be able to backfill passenger revenue, and that our initial sort of preliminary proposal in September would be to return to a normal subsidy level in 2023. I think I'll pause there actually, because I think this is my last one before I go on to TRV. So Ms. Baumke, I don't know if you want to lead off with any comments there, and then we could ask the other members.
Yeah, I'll just first ask the committee, do you have questions for Mark? Okay, seeing none. I don't have any questions at this point in time.
Okay, no problem. So I don't want to make it sound like we have all the answers or even many of the answers yet as far as the return from the pandemic, how ridership is going to land. I think we'll all be watching it closely, talking about it with you, the board, as we get through the fall, and then I think we'll have a much better sense of where the amended 22 budget is likely to end up, and then where the 23 budget will be. So I think in any normal year, this would probably be the biggest item on the agenda is TRV. So hopefully you recall from some of the discussions that Rich has led on this topic. So we have what's called the post-acquisition planned additional service. So now that the acquisition of the right-of-way is underway, we have an opportunity as a part of TRV to increase our service frequency, adding potentially one additional round trip on each of our lines, plus making some schedule changes to optimize the schedule. Funding and financing, doing the budgeting for these potential added trips is very important, but it's only one aspect of that. And, Rich is leading a team internally we have to look at equipment, we have to look at storage, we have to look at how we're going to potentially staff these trains. How do we communicate to riders about it? Many different dimensions for potentially adding service like this. But I think Rich has been clear, and I very much concur with him that in the post-pandemic world, that being able to add frequency, being able to make our service open to more riders is really going to be critical to our success. So adding this service into the budget, determining how much it's likely to cost, determining potentially how much additional incremental ridership we think it'll generate, that will be a very important part of the 23 budget. But we also have to have a lot of flexibility built in around that. We don't know exactly when the right time will be to introduce these trains. We don't want to put a hard date and say, we're going to introduce the trains no matter what. We need to be looking at the ridership environment, making sure that that's the right decision. So the budget is going to have to incorporate that flexibility as well. And then the other issues, maybe I don't know that any of these are as sort of big and strategic, but they're definitely important to the nuts and bolts of the budget. We continue to look at all of the projects in our capital improvement program, update the scopes and schedules and budgets of those projects as TRV evolves, as other initiatives happen, and so we'll be walking through any material changes to those with you all as the committee and the board. This is sort of related to the pandemic and sort of coming out of the pandemic, but we are certainly watching inflation, watching the prices of specific commodities and key inputs to our capital projects. Those price changes can have a big influence both on the operations in terms of contractual increases with our service providers, from year to year, specific things like diesel fuel. But then also, we, given the experience, a little bit of experience that we've had, but also experience that some of our peers have had and other folks here in the region, we do expect to be updating the capital costs of some of our projects with respect to increases in, just the key components like steel and things like that, as those prices are changing. And then the last bullet, Rich and the team here teased me a little bit about the wording on this one, but just we are in an interesting sort of political environment. There are a lot of opportunities. Some of the openness of the build grant now, or I'm sorry, the raise grant to a project like LaFont is definitely an opportunity that we want to take advantage of. There's uncertainty about the infrastructure program on Capitol Hill, how that's going to play out, how that might impact us. So we will certainly be keeping a close eye on that and advising you all as to how that may impact the budget as well. So that's all I have. Ms. Bomke, I'd be happy to turn it back to you for any questions that you committee have.
Committee members, do you have any questions for Mark?
I've got a quick question.
Sure.
This is not a financial question, but looking at our additional train slots, is the state ability to take back a slot still in play? And if I asked for an explanation of that meeting, but I missed the next meeting. I don't know if they ever explained why that was in there, but I'm assuming that's still in play. And is that part of any of the discussions we're having with the state? If we're going to have issues with funding or money to run some of these slots, seeing it's going to come from them in the first place?
So, Mr. Kelly, this is Rich. In play, it's in the agreement, and particularly these post-acquisition slots. There's one round trip on both lines, but I'll caveat that with the one round trip on the Manassas line is subject to further agreements with Norfolk Southern. So, but for those post-acquisition trains, basically the timeline in which the state could, impose anything on us is, it's 3 years beyond implementation of the post-acquisition schedule. And right now, we tentatively are planning to implement that post-acquisition schedule no sooner than after Labor Day, but it could be sometime in the fall. So again, that's a provision that was put in there basically from the state that said, you know, if there's if we get to the point where VRE is not going to add the service, then we, the state, want to have the ability to add additional passenger service. So to answer your question specifically about given the current circumstances and stuff like that, I would generally have to assume that there is some, you know, understanding there. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So,
and Mike up here.
Yeah, I'm not officially a member of the finance committee, but I can tell you that that provision is not intended to be a quick takeaway of any train slots. It's really only in there in case, how do I put this diplomatically? In case the members of the VRE operations board were to come to more of an ideological change that they do not want to run more service. And then the state would need some ability to, in the agreement, to then be able to run service. I know, Matt, we've talked before about if the VRE doesn't have the operations funding to run it, we would talk with VRE and try to work those things through. We're, as Rich mentioned, that 3 years we think is generous to try to work things through in case funding wasn't available. But again, the intention of that is not a, hey, use it and or else we'll quickly take it away. It's not that at all. And as the chief operating officer to VPRA, I can tell you that DJ Stadler, our executive director, feels the same way, and you know, Director Mitchell does too. So it's I understand your concern, but we'll try to work with VRE in case funding was not available.
Mike, and can I respond, Madam Chair?
Sure.
Mike, I understand that, and if we could just have that in beyond a conversation in a finance committee meeting, that, you know, the general consensus on this particular issue, because I did request that information, and again, I wasn't at the meeting after that, that we could have something from your office saying, you know, the intent here is this, and we do not plan on, we will work with you in any way, shape, or form. That I think would make me feel a little bit better, and I hope the board would feel a little bit better to have it, you know, general clarification of how that is playing. And I don't even care if you want to say you're concerned about whether VRE goes off the rail, decides that it gets a bunch of people on here, doesn't want trains anymore. Say it. I don't care. But I would like that comfort level of understanding that, you know, says one thing in the agreement, and if you can give us something in writing that is a caveat to that point, that would be great. Which comes kind of up to a follow-up point that Rich just alluded to a little bit, and it may not be totally to that, but of course we're still waiting on a discussion regarding certain rail aspects of this, and which VRE will again be asked to be making some financial commitments to, and how is that going to be playing out in our upcoming budget? And are we looking at, to my point earlier in the meeting, you know, how is this potentially going to work for us, and what commitments do we want from the state to make sure everybody's happy moving forward with any changes to the rail? I guess it's a Mark or Rich question.
You can start. I can start, and then, yeah, Rich, if you want to jump in. Sure. You know, I think looking ahead at various strategic initiatives that we have, as there's more clarity on that, we will absolutely be talking about it in terms of, you know, how are we using our pandemic relief funds. I think from a pure budgeting perspective, that is absolutely going to be a crucial part of the 23 budget. From a more sort of strategic, what do we get perspective, Rich, I don't know if you have.
Well, let me just say that, going back to what I alluded to before, from a strategic objective, you one of the primary objectives to any type of a deal on the NS line is simply having the ability to operate those additional planned additional services up to and including weekend service out. So, again, that's 4 or 5 years out, but at a minimum, that's what, one of the strategic outcomes should be. And I'll just, point of emphasis is through the budget process. Yes, we are essentially putting a placeholder for strategic initiatives and to carry that, and hopefully that discussion matures as the months go on. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I have one. I feel like the key to this conversation, not as it relates to TRV, but as it relates to our budget ongoing, is going to be the commuting trends. Do you all have the ability to look at data throughout the nation and what is happening in the commuting world? Because in Stafford County, as a government entity, our HR department just brought to us the ability to hire people and allowing them to telecommute 1 or 2 days a week. So I'm curious what kind of conversations you're having in your jurisdictions with your own jurisdiction and with your big employers in the area, ours being Dahlgren to the east of us, and what those companies are saying about teleworking. Because while we are continuing to experience a lot of growth coming south, it is a negotiating tool that employees are now using as they go into new jobs. Anybody want to jump in?
Chair Bomke, this is Rich. Let me just say from the VRE perspective, or maybe even the industry perspective, I've been participating in a series of listening sessions in both nationally and internationally, actually,
Mm-hmm.
and this is not just transit related. It's more. I mean, transit is a broad perspective, and I'm talking from a ridership trend standpoint, but also simply from the commuter rail perspective. There's only 30 of us in North America, and right now it's somewhat of a mixed bag, if you will, in ridership patterns. But one thing that has come out, at least in the most recent listening sessions, is really what's referred to as the discretionary trips or the non-work related commute. So for systems that have, like weekend service or off-peak service, that's where they're seeing the boom of their ridership. In other words, if their non-discretionary ridership was, let's just say 20% of their pre-COVID peak of the peak commute ridership, they're seeing that in upwards of 60-70%. I mean, it's become huge for them, this non-discretionary ridership. So that's when we speak of adding frequency and sort of stretching out that non-peak of the peak commute, essentially that's where we see ridership coming from, as opposed to the traditional, like at VRE, within this couple-hour window in the morning and a couple-hour window in the afternoon. So that's not quite data-driven. Or it is data-driven, but that's more of a narrative explanation. But I found that to be pretty interesting, actually. Our friends to the north, particularly in the New York area, some operations in the Midwest and Chicago and even in California, they're all experiencing that huge onslaught of non-discretionary ridership. So just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Okay, that's very interesting. I appreciate you bringing that up, Rich. Okay, Mark, anything else we need to discuss?
I don't think so. I think we are ready to come back and have a broader discussion with the whole board next month.
Meg, can I just
Okay.
drop one last point in real quick? Because I think
Sure.
Mike's still here too, and I know it's a smaller group now. For whatever it's worth, the state is investing and we're participating with them on a broad expansion of rail in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is a great thing. And we're supporting it and we've been supportive of it. But we are one small piece of a much larger state project, which goes well beyond just commuter rail. And I guess my only concern in moving forward and continuing to participate in some of these projects is it's taking up more of our resources, and yet there's no commitment, as far as I'm aware, of we still getting the resources that we need to continue to operate our piece of that overall plan. And I'm looking at this as the state's taking on a big project here, which is going to cost a lot of money. And as we have these discussions moving forward on additional capacity, on issues of additional lines, that we do put something together as VRE and saying, hey, here are our concerns with regards to future funding, access, et cetera, et cetera. It's a negotiation. I think right now, Mike has been great working with us, and I know will continue to be a great person to deal with. But I know there's got to be some concerns on our ends about future funding and how all this is going to impact us moving forward. And I'm hoping that we will be able to continue to have those conversations and we can continue to be a good partner. But this is, as far as I'm concerned, a negotiation. The state wants our support. They should have our support. But, at the same time, we need some potentially additional commitments out of the state looking down the road long term. That's where I'm going in all this. Thank you.
I appreciate your comments, Matt. Okay, with no one else having anything, and I think others have signed off, we'll adjourn our meeting. I do want to let you know I will be at the beach on the July 16th, so I'll be logging in from there. So I will not be at the meeting in person, but I have let Leslie know that.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, with that, everybody have a great 4th of July.
Thank you, Ms. Bonke. Thanks, everyone.
You as well. Thank you. Stay
All
safe.
right.
Stay hydrated.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rich and Mark. Take care.
Thank you.